Deep in the forgotten heart of a cursed forest lies a nameless village where the people are haunted by invisible fears, festering memories, and curses that cling like rot. No one talks about it, yet everyone knows of the drifter, the shadow who can grant you peace from the screams within your head but at an unspeakable cost. Some say he can strip you clean of memories that stain your mind. Others believe he can twist you beyond recognition. But whatever he does, everyone agrees on one thing: not a single soul leaves him unchanged. This is the story of Lila, a young woman who sought out the drifter to escape her own torment and the nightmare she embraced in the process. Lila had been plagued by a relentless tide of intrusive thoughts, twisted dreams that would not let her rest. At night, she could feel whispers crawling through her skull like maggots burrowing into her brain, replaying memories that she couldn't escape. The images of her past traumas, the scenes she couldn't bear to relive, all returned to her as if fed by some dark presence. Driven to the edge, she had heard of the drifter, the one who could unfuck a mind. So, one cold evening, Lila set out for the forest, determined to find him and finally silence the voices. The descent begins. Her journey began along a barely discernible path where the trees grew like towering phantoms, their branches twisting downwards like skeletal fingers. The forest was alive in a way that felt wrong, roots shifting underfoot, branches creaking even without wind. Every sound, every rustle seemed to whisper, "Turn back." But Lila pressed on, her sanity dangling by a thread that grew thinner with every step. As she ventured deeper, her senses became disoriented. Time seemed to stretch and bend. Shadows merged into shapes, strange twisted figures, like something out of her worst nightmares. She stumbled into a clearing and saw a grotesque tree with branches dripping a thick red sap that congealed like blood in the dirt below. Lila couldn't help but stare, transfixed, as a form began to shift in the sap. A shape that resembled her own face, twisted in a silent scream. Her stomach lurched, but she forced herself to look away, suppressing the scream that clawed at her throat. "You're already losing it," she thought, clinging to the last shreds of her sanity. Not long after, she reached a small, hollow cave where a deep, echoing voice began to murmur her deepest fears. The words dripped like venom, and she could almost feel them burning through her skin, etching themselves into her mind. She tried to cover her ears, but the sound burrowed into her skull, reverberating through her bones. When she finally managed to stagger away, her ears were bleeding, and her fingers left red smears on her skin as she tried to wipe the voices away. But her path did not end there. Next came a pond, murky and stagnant, where ghostly figures drifted beneath the surface, their faces twisted in anguish. She recognized them, not by name, but by their hollow eyes, their desperate, soundless pleas. These were the souls of those who had sought out the drifter and failed. Their stories, their fears, their horrors seemed to ooze from the pond, staining the air with a cold dread that wrapped around Lila like a shroud. She forced herself to keep going, her heartbeat a relentless drum in her chest. The encounter. Finally, after what felt like hours, she found herself standing before him. The drifter was a gaunt figure wrapped in tattered robes, his face obscured by shadows, yet somehow watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When he spoke, his voice was low and oily, seeping into her mind like poison. "You want me to unfuck your mind?" he said, as if mocking her. "You know the price." Lila nodded, her body numb with terror. She didn't care what the price was anymore. She was willing to sacrifice anything if it meant freedom from the horrors that tormented her. To cleanse your mind, you must offer the memory that holds your soul, the essence of who you are. As he spoke, his fingers began to move, weaving intricate patterns in the air, and Lila felt a strange pull, as if something deep within her was being torn apart. The ritual had begun. The drifter led her to a stone altar covered in strange, dark stains, remnants of the sacrifices made before her. He instructed her to lie down, her body pressing against the cold, unforgiving stone. As she lay there, she began to feel a sharp, searing pain as the drifter's hands hovered over her, pulling memories from her mind with an intensity that felt like her skull was being ripped open. She felt herself reliving her most painful memories, the moments she had buried so deep that even she had almost forgotten them. Every buried trauma was forced to the surface, twisted and magnified. She could feel them leaving wounds on her soul, clawing their way out of her as she writhed on the stone. Blood trickled from her nose, her eyes, her ears, as the drifter continued, his fingers moving with a relentless precision. Her mind became a fractured landscape of horrors, each memory reassembling into grotesque, distorted versions of itself. She could see herself as a child, alone and afraid, her parents' faces twisted into gory parodies as they abandoned her. She could feel her heartbreaks, her losses, her deepest fears all coming to life around her, surrounding her with a suffocating weight of despair. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined, yet she couldn't scream. It was as if her voice had been stolen, trapped within her, just another echo in the endless nightmare she had unleashed. The drifter's voice became louder, demanding more. "Give me your most cherished memory, the one that defines you." Lila's mind fought to hold onto it, but her body was too broken, her spirit too shattered. She could feel the memory slipping, that last anchor of her identity dissolving under the drifter's will. She tried to cling to it, to keep a piece of herself intact, but it was like holding on to smoke, slipping through her fingers as she reached. Finally, with a final brutal twist, the drifter wrenched the memory from her. She felt a tearing sensation deep inside, something breaking that could never be mended. Her mind felt hollow, empty, a desolate shell stripped of everything she had been. The memory was gone, taken from her, leaving only an unfillable void that pulsed with a dull, throbbing ache. For a moment, there was silence. Lila lay on the altar, her body and mind broken, her senses a blur of pain and emptiness. She could feel the drifter's presence, watching her with an intensity that felt almost satisfied. When he finally released her, she stumbled back through the forest, her mind a fractured maze of darkness. The horrors she had witnessed, the pieces of herself she had sacrificed, all clung to her like shadows, each one a scar that would never heal. She had come seeking freedom, but instead, she had been left with a mind even more twisted and broken than before. As she made her way back to the village, she could feel the madness growing within her, a dark seed planted by the drifter's ritual. The memories she had lost haunted her, not as images but as sensations, twinges of pain, flashes of terror that flared without warning. She could no longer trust her own thoughts, her own mind, as reality itself began to twist and distort around her. The villagers who saw her return whispered among themselves, noting the vacant look in her eyes, the haunted expression that seemed to bore through everything. She had come back, but Lila was no longer truly there. Whatever the drifter had done, he had left her trapped within her own shattered psyche, a prisoner to the horrors that now infested her mind. In the end, Lila had gotten what she had asked for. Her mind had been unfucked, cleansed of the memories that had once defined her. But what she was left with was a mind stripped of all meaning, a soul hollowed by the very process that was meant to save her. She was a living husk, cursed to wander her village as a silent warning to those who might seek the drifter's aid. As for the drifter, he remained in the forest, waiting for the next soul desperate enough to seek his help, eager to strip them of their identity and leave them as hollow and broken as those who had come before. Lila drifted through her village in a daze, feeling like a ghost among the living. Her memories were gone, stripped from her mind and leaving her hollow, lost. Yet there was something deeper beneath that emptiness, a darkness within her that felt both foreign and disturbingly familiar, as though it had always been a part of her, waiting for the right moment to emerge. One night, driven by a compulsion she couldn't understand, she found herself drawn back into the forest, her body moving as if under another's control. She staggered through the twisted trees and blood-red shadows until she reached the clearing where she had first encountered the drifter. And there, standing as though he had been waiting all along, was the drifter himself, his form a dark, tattered silhouette under the moonlight. But this time, he felt different. The shadows that had obscured his face before now began to thin, revealing a face that made Lila's blood run cold. She knew that face. It was hers. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. The drifter's face was her face, older, gaunt, and hollow, but unmistakably her own. Her own features stared back at her, twisted with a sinister, knowing smile. It was as though she was looking into the depths of a mirror, one that reflected not just her body, but her very soul. Lila's mind raced, trying to understand. The drifter's voice slithered into her mind, as smooth and oily as before, but now laced with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "You sought me out, Lila. You wanted freedom from the voices, the fears, the memories. You asked me to help you unfuck your mind, but you're me," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words felt foreign, as if someone else was speaking through her. The drifter's smile widened, a grotesque mirror of her own expression. "Yes, and I always have been. You are the one who forgot." A flood of memories surged through her mind, ones she had never seen before, yet recognized with bone-chilling certainty. Images of herself wandering this forest, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and desperation, seeking freedom from memories that she herself had locked away. Memories she had returned to time and time again, each time sacrificing a piece of herself, each time becoming less of who she had once been. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't real. It is real, Lila. You are the drifter. You always have been. Each time you sought to cleanse your mind, you lost yourself. Piece by piece, memory by memory, you willingly sacrificed your own soul, hoping to escape the darkness within. But each time, the darkness grew. The horror settled into her mind like an iron weight. Every person who had encountered the drifter, the souls she had seen in the pond, the whispers from the cave, they had all been herself, fragments of her past selves. With every journey into the forest, every plea to unfuck her mind, she had stripped away her own identity until there was nothing left but this hollow shell, wandering the forest as both the seeker and the tormentor. "Why?" she choked out, tears streaming down her face. "Why am I doing this to myself?" The drifter, the dark echo of herself, smiled, a cruel glint in its eyes. "Because, Lila, the truth you've always feared is that the darkness isn't in your memories. It's in you. You are the fear, you are the curse. And no matter how many memories you strip away, no matter how many times you try to cleanse yourself, you can't escape who you truly are." A wave of cold realization washed over her. This was her fate, a cycle of forgetting and remembering, stripping away her identity only to relearn the same horrifying truth. She was the drifter, forever trapped in a self-imposed nightmare, unable to escape the dark essence within her. As the moonlight dimmed and shadows closed in around her, she felt herself fading, slipping away into darkness. In her final moments, she understood the twisted irony of her fate. She had come to unfuck her mind, but in doing so, she had destroyed her own soul, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Detective Ellis Monroe had long ago grown numb to the gruesome details that came with his work. But this time, he felt something different, a visceral unease as he stared at the case file laid open on his desk. It was a collection of yellowed photos and newspaper clippings from 1986, an era infamously plagued by the so-called Satanic Panic. Yet these files weren't just about misplaced fears or mass hysteria. They held reports of a series of murders, supposedly ritualistic, from a rural town that had since faded from memory. As Ellis flipped through the old photographs, he tried to process the bizarre, gory images. Photos of makeshift altars drenched in blood, mutilated bodies, and symbols carved into trees. The victims' eyes had been gouged out, their lips sewn shut. Detective Monroe, his supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Vargas, stood in his doorway, her arms crossed. I'm not sure you should be looking into that case. Ellis looked up, frowning. Why's that? She sighed. Because everyone who's ever tried to investigate these cases, well, they either quit or disappeared. Disappeared? Ellis's voice was skeptical, but his fingers continued to grip the edges of the old file. Listen, Vargas continued, lowering her voice. These aren't just stories about crazed lunatics. There were rumors of something larger, a cult, or even an organized sect. They hid behind the Satanic Panic of the 80s, used it as cover, and we have every reason to believe they're still active. Ellis felt a chill crawl up his spine. He flipped the file shut. Permission to dig deeper? Vargas paused, giving him a knowing look before she nodded. Be careful. The journey took Ellis to Fairgrove, a small town that hadn't seemed to age since the 1980s. There, he found one of the retired officers who had been on the case decades earlier. Detective Sam Thatcher was frail, his hands trembling as he poured himself a whiskey at the dingy bar where they met. Why'd you want to meet here? Ellis asked, eyeing the locals, who seemed to avoid Thatcher's gaze with silent reverence. Thatcher sipped his drink before finally looking up. This is the only place where they can't hear us. They, Ellis pressed. The cult. Thatcher's voice was barely a whisper. They're still out there, Detective. We were never supposed to dig too deep. Those murders, they were ritual sacrifices, a pact, and anyone who got too close. Thatcher trailed off, his eyes unfocused, like he was reliving something too horrible to say out loud. Ellis leaned forward. Tell me what happened. The old man shook his head, then laughed bitterly. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. Thatcher's hands clenched around his glass. The bodies we found, they weren't just murdered, they were butchered. Some were found with their skin peeled back, others had their hearts ripped out. And then there were the symbols, carved into every tree, drawn in blood around the bodies. What kind of symbols? Ellis's voice was low, as if speaking any louder would disturb the ghosts that lingered in the room. Thatcher's eyes glazed over as he muttered, They called them the marks of the fallen. They said they were offerings for something beyond our world. Ellis felt no closer to answers as he left Thatcher, his mind a haze of horrific images. He decided to follow up on a lead about a reclusive figure known in town as the Keeper, an elderly man who had been rumored to be present at the last known site of a ritual. The Keeper's cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, and Ellis had to hike for nearly an hour to reach it. The air grew thick as he approached, a heaviness pressing down on him. The Keeper sat on his porch, his gaze sharp despite his age. Detective, he greeted, as if he'd been expecting him. I know why you're here. Ellis nodded cautiously. You were there, weren't you? During the rituals. The Keeper looked off into the trees. The things I've seen would freeze your blood, son. They carved people up, one by one in those woods. Tore them apart like animals. The cult calls it the feeding, and they say the blood opens a gateway to the underworld. Why did they stop? Ellis asked, his stomach twisting at the thought. The Keeper turned his gaze back to him, unblinking. They never stopped. They just got smarter. Now they choose their victims carefully, avoid the media. But they're still here, still feeding, and they've been waiting for someone like you. Ellis froze, his pulse quickening. What do you mean? The Keeper's voice dropped to a whisper. You're the perfect sacrifice, Detective. They love a martyr, and they've been watching you, following you. Once you started digging, you were already marked. Ellis could feel the weight of the forest closing in around him. The air was thick, damp with an unsettling silence that only deepened as he made his way toward the flickering glow ahead. He forced himself to keep moving, each step sinking into the soft, damp earth as he followed the faint chanting that grew louder with every step. When he reached the clearing, he froze, his heart hammering. A circle of hooded figures surrounded a stone altar, their hands lifted to the sky in reverence. Symbols and words written in an ancient, sinister script covered their robes, symbols Ellis recognized from the files he had studied obsessively. Inverted pentagrams, horns, serpents, and the name Lucifer etched over and over in dark crimson ink. The cultists chanted in a language Ellis couldn't understand, their words guttural and feverish, echoing through the trees. The words felt like they were reaching into his mind, warping his thoughts and stirring some primal part of him that recoiled in horror. A voice rang out from the center of the circle, louder than the others. It belonged to a figure dressed in a robe darker than night, his face hidden beneath the hood. Brothers and sisters, he intoned, his voice dripping with authority and malice. Tonight, we offer blood in the name of our true Lord, the bringer of light, Lucifer. The cultists murmured in agreement, bowing their heads as the leader continued. We are the chosen few, the ones who understand the truth of Satan's promise. We reject the hollow lies of light and salvation. We seek knowledge, power, and eternal life, gifts that only the morning star, the fallen Lucifer, can grant us. Ellis's skin crawled as he watched them, horrified yet transfixed. They didn't see themselves as killers or madmen. They saw themselves as enlightened seekers, followers of some twisted gospel of darkness. The leader gestured to a figure tied to the altar, a young man barely conscious, his chest heaving in ragged gasps. His body was marked with fresh cuts and bruises, symbols carved into his flesh that mirrored those on the cultist's robes. His mouth was sewn shut, his eyes wild with terror as he thrashed against his restraints. One of the cultists stepped forward, a blade gleaming in his hand. "With this sacrifice we open the gateway to the infernal realm," he declared, his voice trembling with fervor. "We summon our Lord Satan, the great adversary, to bring his power into this world." Ellis's stomach turned as he watched the blade descend, carving a deep line across the man's chest. Blood poured from the wound, pooling on the stone and dripping onto the ground where the earth seemed to drink it in, almost hungrily. The leader raised his hands, his eyes alight with an unnatural fervor. "Lucifer, devil, fallen one, hear us, accept this sacrifice, and let your presence flood this world once more," the cultists chanted, their voices growing louder, almost ecstatic. Ellis could feel something dark, something ancient, stirring around him, as if the very air had come alive with malice. He felt a presence, a cold, oppressive weight that pressed down on him, wrapping around his chest, making it hard to breathe. The leader stepped forward, drawing symbols in the blood with his fingers, symbols Ellis recognized from occult texts, ancient seals associated with demonic rites, symbols that were said to invite Satan himself into the mortal realm. "We are yours, O Prince of Darkness," he whispered, his voice barely audible but laced with reverence. "We live to serve you, to carry your will. Give us the strength to bring this world to its knees. Show us the power of damnation." The air grew colder, and the ground beneath Ellis seemed to tremble. Shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes that shouldn't exist, shapes that seemed almost alive. He could feel the pull, the sickening allure of the cult's faith. It was a darkness so complete, so ancient, that it threatened to consume him whole. As the chanting reached a fevered pitch, the cult leader turned his gaze toward Ellis, his eyes burning with an unholy fire. "Welcome, detective," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We've been waiting for you." Before Ellis could react, the cultists surrounded him, their hands reaching out, gripping his arms, his shoulders, dragging him toward the altar. He struggled, but their grip was iron, and the presence, the dark force that seemed to watch him from the shadows, was overwhelming. "Tonight," the leader whispered, leaning close, "we offer you as a gift to Lucifer. You will become his voice, his vessel, his servant in this world. You came looking for us, detective, but you found far more than you ever wanted." Ellis's vision blurred as they forced him onto the blood-soaked altar, binding him with ropes that cut into his flesh. He could feel the warmth of the blood beneath him, the smell of copper and decay filling his nostrils. The cultists began a new chant, their voices low and rhythmic, each word seeping into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. He felt his will slipping, his mind fraying as the darkness seeped in, filling every corner of his being. "Accept him, O devil," the leader intoned, raising his hand. "Let him be your servant, your harbinger, your voice among men. Through him we shall know your wrath, your vengeance, your unending thirst for power." As the knife descended, Ellis felt a burning pain, a pain that was more than physical, a tearing sensation deep within him, as if something were ripping his soul from his body. He screamed, but his voice was lost in the chanting, swallowed by the darkness that surrounded him. And in that moment he felt it, a presence, cold and ancient, sliding into his mind, filling the empty spaces, taking control. He was no longer himself. He was something more, something darker. The last thing he saw before his vision went dark was the cultists bowing before him, their faces alight with reverence and fear, their voices chanting a single name, Lucifer. And as the darkness claimed him, he understood. He was no longer Ellis Monroe. He was something far older, far more dangerous, a vessel of the devil, a harbinger of Lucifer's will on earth. And he was ready to carry out their twisted gospel of terror. Days later, the townspeople found the clearing in the woods, but there was no sign of Ellis Monroe. All they found were traces of blood, a stone slab stained dark, and symbols carved into the trees. The cult was gone, vanished into the night, leaving only the memory of their dark rites and the unsettling sense that they would one day return. Ellis was never seen again. But those who ventured too close to the woods claimed to hear whispers, faint but unmistakable, of a desperate man trapped between worlds, his voice mingling with the ancient chants that echoed from the shadows. Years passed, and the story of Detective Ellis Monroe faded into local legend. The woods around Fairgrove grew over with brambles and vines, swallowing whatever traces remained of that dark night. But the locals still spoke of him in hushed voices, warning one another to avoid the forest, especially after dark. One night, long after anyone in town remembered Ellis's face, a group of teenagers dared each other to venture into the forest. They set out after midnight, their flashlights trembling as they whispered about the legends of the occult and Ellis's disappearance. As they walked deeper into the forest, they began to feel a growing chill, as if the air itself were thick with dread. The forest seemed to close in around them, shadows moving unnaturally, and whispers echoed in the distance, almost as if the trees themselves were speaking. But the whispers grew louder, taking on a familiar voice, a voice one of the teens, a girl named Hannah, recognized from years of hearing her grandfather talk about him. The voice called her name. "Hannah," it rasped, "you have to help me." The group froze, and Hannah stepped forward, drawn toward the sound. There, barely illuminated by her flashlight, was a figure lying on the ground, his face obscured by dirt and blood but unmistakable. It was Detective Ellis Monroe, alive but barely. "Ellis?" she whispered, fear and confusion twisting her voice. He reached out with a trembling hand. "They didn't let me die," he whispered, his voice cracked and hollow. "They kept me here, trapped, feeding off me." "What do you mean?" Hannah asked, horror dawning in her eyes as she watched his broken figure, covered in strange scars and symbols that pulsed faintly under his skin. "They took my soul but left my body as a conduit. Every time someone dies in these woods, I'm forced to relive that night. Every sacrifice, every drop of blood, it all feeds through me." He coughed and blood trickled from his mouth, but his grip tightened on her arm, desperate. "I need you to end this, Hannah. Burn the woods, destroy everything, before they use me to bring something worse." Suddenly, a chilling laugh echoed around them, as if the forest itself were mocking them. Shadows crept closer, morphing into figures with pale, empty faces. The cult had returned. They watched in silence, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Hannah pulled away, her heart racing. "Ellis, we have to get you out of here." But Ellis shook his head. "I'm already dead, Hannah. You have to destroy my body. It's the only way to break the curse. If you don't, they'll use me. They'll use me to bring their God into this world." Just as she nodded, steeling herself for what had to be done, Ellis's expression changed. His face contorted, his eyes darkening. He laughed, a low, malevolent sound that didn't belong to him. "Oh, but it's too late," he sneered, his voice now layered with a darker, unnatural tone. "They've already succeeded. I am their God, and I've been here all along, waiting to be released." As the cult members moved forward, surrounding them, Ellis's eyes turned entirely black, and his mouth twisted into a smile filled with ancient malice. In that instant, Hannah realized the horrifying truth. Ellis was no longer himself. He had become the vessel for something far older, far darker. Something that had been waiting patiently in the shadows, bound only by the ritual that had once taken him. The cultists chanted, their voices rising as the forest seemed to come alive, the trees bending, the earth rumbling. As the ground split open beneath her feet, Hannah's last thought before the darkness overtook her was that the stories had never told the full truth. The Satanic Panic had been more than hysteria. It had been a warning, a warning that the real horror had always been waiting beneath the surface, biding its time. And now, with Ellis's body as its bridge, it was free. As the ground closed around Hannah, muffling her screams, the figure of Ellis Monroe stood alone in the clearing, staring out with hollow, blackened eyes. A cold, dark smile spread across his face as he took his first steps out of the forest and into the unsuspecting world. The evil that had waited so long in the shadows was finally free to walk among men, wearing the face of a dead man, ready to begin its work anew. Tess's fingers trembled as she ran them over the invitation. It felt heavier than any paper had a right to be, the words embossed in red ink, thick, dark, almost sticky. The message was brief, an invitation to dine at Adrienne Valois's private table. Only 12 guests will join him in the mountains, dress in black, no electronics, no questions, 8 p.m. Tess had heard the stories, the rumors. Valois was more than a chef. He was a cult legend. Some said he had a pact with dark forces, that each bite of his food cost his patrons a piece of their soul. She told herself it was nonsense, urban myths cooked up to enhance the mystery surrounding his notorious pop-up events. But this invitation didn't feel like nonsense, it felt like something ominous. As the night of the dinner approached, Tess's stomach tightened with dread and excitement. This was it, her golden ticket. She could already picture her article, Dining with the Devil, the untold story of Adrienne Valois. She boarded the bus arranged for them, an old creaking vehicle that snaked up a winding mountain road. The other guests were quiet, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats or silk scarves. She recognized a few, a tech CEO, a reclusive author, a politician notorious for his cruelty. Their eyes gleamed with a shared hunger. When they reached the abandoned monastery, the driver wordlessly opened the door. The guests filed out, moving as one into the vast, candle-lit hall. A chill ran down Tess's spine as she glanced around, noticing ancient relics and grotesque carvings peeking from the shadows. Adrienne Valois stood silently at the head of the table, his face unreadable as he surveyed the guests before him. In the dim candlelight, his pale eyes seemed to glint with something almost predatory, as though he were savoring them before they'd even taken a bite. With a flick of his wrist, he motioned to a masked server who stepped forward carrying a silver platter. When the server lifted the lid, the guests gasped. The dish was unlike anything Tess had ever seen. Thin, twisting tendrils arranged in delicate coils, glistening with oil. They were fleshy, pale and slick, each one seeming to glisten with a viscous crimson sheen that caught the candlelight. They writhed slightly as though some faint, lingering impulse was keeping them alive, twitching under the touch of the tongs. "Our first course is despair," Adrienne murmured, his voice soft and cold, harvested from a man who knew nothing but anguish. His suffering, distilled and transformed for your appreciation. The guests glanced uneasily at one another. Tess noticed the politician across from her reach for his water glass, his hand trembling as his eyes fixed on the tendrils with something between revulsion and fascination. One by one, the guests lifted their forks, hesitating, their movements slow and unsure. Tess swallowed hard, telling herself this was simply some elaborate culinary illusion. She lifted a forkful, her hand shaking, and brought it closer. The smell hit her first, a coppery tang, sharp and metallic, mingling with a sickly sweet scent that reminded her of raw meat left too long in the heat. Her stomach turned, but her curiosity was stronger than her revulsion. The tendril was soft, almost yielding against her fork. As she placed it in her mouth, the texture was even worse than she'd imagined. Rubbery, faintly elastic, as if it were resisting her teeth. When she bit down, a dark liquid oozed out, coating her tongue in a rush of sour, salty bitterness that made her gag. Instantly, a wave of nausea hit her, and with it, a vision. Images flooded her mind, crashing into her like a tidal wave. Visions of fire and smoke, a man screaming as he watched his home burn, his family trapped inside, his cries swallowed by the flames. Tess gasped, feeling as though she were suffocating, her throat closing as the man's despair seeped into her own veins. She could hear his voice, raw and broken, echoing inside her skull. She forced herself to swallow, feeling the tendril slide down her throat, heavy and cold. As it settled in her stomach, an unsettling realization dawned on her. The texture, the look of the tendril. Her mind circled around a single, horrific possibility, a suspicion too grotesque to voice. Beside her, the CEO coughed, choking back bile, his face ashen. He put down his fork, glancing around the table with wide eyes. "Is this?" His voice trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought, but the look on his face mirrored Tess's own unease. Adrian's thin smile widened. "Does it not intrigue you?" he asked, his voice a velvet purr. "The depth of emotion contained within a single bite? I've spent years perfecting my art, extracting suffering from the flesh itself, distilling it until only the purest essence remains." The words lingered in the air, chilling in their implication. Tess looked down at her plate, her stomach twisting as she studied the remaining tendrils. The shape, the soft ridges along their length, it all seemed horrifically familiar, like something ripped from deep inside a body. She could almost see them as they might have been, coiled within a human abdomen, pulsing with life. The politician beside her was trembling, his fork clattering to the plate. He looked pale, beads of sweat dotting his brow as he struggled to hold back his horror. You can't be serious," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Adrian's eyes flicked to him, a flicker of amusement dancing in their pale depths. "I assure you, everything here tonight is quite authentic." Tess felt a wave of revulsion wash over her, bile rising in her throat. She fought to keep her composure, to push down the realization gnawing at her mind, but her imagination betrayed her, conjuring images of the tendrils in their original form, twisting, pulsing, pulled from a living body in an agony too profound to comprehend. All around the table, the guests were shuddering, their faces pale as they grappled with their own understanding. Some clutched at their stomachs, others at their throats, as though trying to dispel the visceral horror that Adrian's words had planted in their minds. Adrian's gaze swept over them, a slight satisfied smile tugging at his lips. "True despair, my friends," he murmured, "is not just tasted, it is absorbed. It becomes part of you, lingers in your blood, in your dreams. Tonight you have been given a rare opportunity to partake in something few dare to experience." He raised his own fork, piercing one of the tendrils and bringing it to his lips. As he chewed, his face took on a look of rapture, his eyes fluttering closed as if he were savoring the very essence of anguish. The guests were silent, each one caught in their own torment, unable to speak, to move, to react. They had come for an experience, for a taste of something otherworldly, and they were getting exactly what they'd asked for. The courses grew darker, each one paired with a story. Adrian described the sources of each dish with disturbing detail, stories of heartbreak, betrayal, violence. The second course was survivor's guilt, a thick, oozing stew that clung to the guests' throats, making them gag. "It's from a soldier," Adrian explained, the only survivor of a horrific massacre. He carried the weight of his fallen comrades, their screams echoing in his mind until he succumbed. Tess forced herself to eat, trying to keep her composure, but as she swallowed, she felt herself slipping, as if she were standing in a battlefield, feeling bullets whiz by her head, hearing screams all around her. Her stomach churned, bile rising to her throat. The other guests were visibly shaken. The politician beside her was sweating, wiping his brow as he gagged, his face pale. What is this?" he gasped, clutching his chest. "How is this possible?" Adrian's gaze turned icy. "Those who question the meal are welcome to leave. However, doing so may have consequences." The politician said nothing further, but Tess noticed he was shaking. Chapter 4: Deceit. As the courses continued, each more grotesque than the last, the atmosphere grew tense. Adrian's assistants brought out a third course, a series of thin slices of meat, almost translucent, with a sheen that looked unnatural. Adrian called it deceit. "This one comes from a man who lived a double life," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "He cheated on his wife, deceived his friends, built an empire on lies. The very essence of his deceit is infused into this dish." Tess took a reluctant bite. Her mouth filled with a metallic taste like rust and rot, and she felt the weight of the man's lies pressing down on her. Her thoughts grew muddled, her vision blurred, and she felt as though her own mind were fragmenting, pieces of her identity slipping away like sand through her fingers. Around her, she heard guests whispering, confessing things in strangled gasps, secrets they would never have shared under any other circumstances. I can't take this," muttered the tech CEO. This is poison." Adrian smiled, a wicked glint in his eyes. Poison, or perhaps revelation. The line is thin. Chapter 5: The Hidden Room. As the courses continued, each one growing more unpalatable, Tess felt herself reaching her limit. When Adrian and his servers slipped away to prepare the next dish, she seized her chance to explore. Slipping out of the dining hall, she wandered down a narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing in the dark. At the end of the hall, she found a small, unmarked door. Pushing it open, she was greeted by a sight that made her blood run cold. The room was filled with glass jars, each one containing something grotesque: eyes, fingers, tongues, preserved in murky liquid. But that wasn't the worst of it. There were photos pinned to the walls, each depicting Adrian standing beside people in various stages of agony. A closer look revealed that the faces of some of her fellow diners were among them. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. These weren't just ingredients. They were his victims, people he had carefully selected, studied, and broken down piece by piece. Enjoying the exhibit? Adrian's voice came from behind her. She turned, heart racing as he stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a cold amusement. "You see, I don't just cook food, Miss Tess. I cook emotions, memories, sins. I distill them, extract the essence of a person until there's nothing left. Then I serve it back, and watch as others consume their agony." He reached out, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Tonight you're not just a guest. You're an ingredient." Back in the dining hall, Tess's mind raced, her vision blurring from fear. She sat frozen, watching as Adrian's assistants wheeled out a final platter covered in a silver cloche. Adrian stepped forward, his expression solemn. "Tonight's final course is the culmination of a journey," he said, his voice almost reverent. "This one is curiosity." Tess's heart stopped as Adrian lifted the cloche, revealing a plate holding something that looked disturbingly familiar. It was a slice of flesh, slightly charred, and next to it was a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "Curiosity is a powerful thing," Adrian murmured, his gaze fixed on Tess. "It brought you here, didn't it? Led you down a path you couldn't turn away from. And now, it will be your undoing." Tess felt her throat tighten as Adrian lifted the vial, tipping a single drop of the liquid onto her plate. The scent was overpowering, a mix of rot and iron, and she felt her body react violently, her skin crawling as the memories of everyone who had come before her surged through her mind. Adrian placed a fork in her hand. "Go on, take a bite." She tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. Her hand moved of its own accord, the fork piercing the flesh on the plate. As she brought it to her lips, she felt an overwhelming wave of nausea, her senses assaulted by the screams, the despair, the horror of the lives Adrian had consumed. As she swallowed, she felt her own mind fracturing, pieces of her identity slipping away, dissolving into the void. Her memories, her thoughts, her very essence pulled into Adrian's twisted masterpiece. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was Adrian's face, his expression one of satisfaction, a chef savoring his finest creation. The bus left the monastery as quietly as it had come, carrying the empty, soulless shells of the diners back down the mountain. Tess's camera, left running on the table, captured the silent, empty dining hall, the faint echo of laughter lingering in the air. Weeks after the dinner, an unmarked package arrived at the headquarters of the New World Review, Tess's employer. Inside, the editor found a hard drive and a note, written in Tess's unmistakable handwriting, "For publication upon receipt. My final story. Tess." The editor, Tom, who had been anxiously awaiting any word from Tess after her mysterious disappearance, was both relieved and confused. He connected the drive to his computer, fingers twitching with apprehension. The files were labeled in chronological order, each one a recording of the night's events from Tess's hidden camera. Tom leaned in, drawn into the screen as the chilling details unfolded. The courses, the grotesque descriptions, the agony on the guests' faces, and finally, Adrian's monologue. When he reached the final recording, he watched Tess take her final bite, her face contorted in horror, and then the screen went black. He sat back, numb, disturbed, and ready to shut off his computer when a new file suddenly appeared on the desktop. It was titled Dessert. Hesitantly, he clicked on it. The video showed a sterile kitchen, pristine and cold. A camera focused on a single, elegant dish centered on a black plate, a delicate pastry topped with a thin drizzle of crimson sauce. Adrian's voice, smooth and commanding, filled the room as he appeared in frame, wearing a serene, satisfied smile. "Welcome, dear viewers," Adrian intoned, gazing into the camera. "This is my gift to you all, Tess's ambition." Tom's stomach dropped as Adrian continued, explaining that he'd anticipated Tess's desire to uncover his secrets. "I knew she'd bring her camera, hoping to expose me. But ambition, unchecked, ravenous ambition, well, that's what I thrive on." The screen cut to a clip of Adrian meticulously plating small, delicate portions, shavings of raw flesh, fragments of tendon, each one arranged with surgical precision. "My art is meant to be shared," he murmured, his voice smooth as he worked. "And Tess, with all her ambition, will now be consumed by thousands." Tom's hands trembled as the realization hit. Adrian had somehow ensured Tess's essence was preserved, distilled, in the digital files themselves, ready to be unleashed upon anyone who watched. Every scream, every ounce of fear, her final agony, all of it embedded, now seeping from the screen. He felt a strange pull, a dark compulsion, as though Tess's final moments were worming their way into his mind, taking root. And it wasn't just him. The entire newsroom was drawn to the screen, unable to look away. As the video played on, Adrian's voice grew louder, his eyes locking with the camera, his smile twisting into something sinister. "This story will consume you." In that moment, Tom understood. Adrian's masterpiece wasn't just for the 12 guests that night. It was meant for every viewer who dared to watch. He had created a new type of feast, one that transcended the physical, a digital dish that would drive anyone who saw it to the brink of madness. Adrian's art wasn't confined to flesh anymore. It had evolved, infecting minds, spreading terror until the boundaries of reality and horror dissolved. A knock on the door jolted Tom. "Come in," he muttered, still transfixed. The door creaked open, and Tess walked in, her eyes vacant, a hollow smile on her lips. "Hi, Tom," she whispered, her voice distant, almost mechanical. "Adrian said it was time for me to serve."